Say you walk into a restaurant and you're looking for something to satisfy your hunger. You pick up the menu and you scan it. You see salads, soups, lunch, dinner. Sadly, you begin to realize that nothing looks particularly appetizing. The choices sound bland, unsatisfying, or just strange. Some of the menu is incomprehensible. Resigned, maybe even a little angry, you put the menu down and leave, convincing yourself you're not so hungry after all. This seems to be the experience of many people who walk into a synagogue. Of course not Oseh Shalom, but I've heard. The spiritual hunger is there, but what's on the menu is unsatisfying at best, actively distasteful at worst, and one major factor is that a major ingredient on the prayer menu, God, isn't something many people have much taste for. So we could stay away from this particular restaurant and seek sustenance elsewhere. But to do so is to lose access to a rich, powerful tradition of spiritual practice. So if the God ingredient is keeping us from having meaningful Jewish prayer lives, then perhaps it's time to try to fix it. So these words that I've been sharing with you so far are words from a prominent Reconstructionist rabbi named Toba Spitzer. And Toba is the rabbi of a Reconstructionist community in the Boston area called Dorsey Tzedek. She was also my boss for about a year and a half when I worked for the Reconstructionist movement doing Tikkun Olam work about 20 years ago. And perhaps her greatest claim to fame is that she and our own Dan Glazer went to Habonim Camp Mosheva a few years ago. In 2022, she wrote a really interesting book called God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. And I want to share a number of ideas from that book with you this evening and also share some of my own thinking on those ideas and how they've applied in my own life. Although I highly recommend reading the whole book. So Toba writes, in the West, there is a cluster of ideas that define what God is. Big and awesome, holding ultimate power over us, a force for good. When we talk about God, we all tend to use similar human language to describe God's actions and attributes. God knows, God loves, God judges, God gives and takes away life. Even if we vehemently don't believe in God, the God we don't believe in is an all-powerful, supposedly good person somewhere up there. The problem is many of us just don't believe in a God like that. We reject the notion of a God that controls the world and us like a puppet master. We can't believe in someone who we're told is both all-powerful and all good because when we look around the world or at our own lives, it's very clear there's a whole lot of not good there. So either God is irrelevant or not so good or just not very plausible. So what's vitally important to understand is that what we've been told is a description or what we've been told is a description or a definition of God is in fact a metaphor. Not a metaphor in the sense of a literary flourish or a figure of speech, but what's called a conceptual metaphor that actively shapes our lives. So consider the metaphor, time is a limited resource. In our culture, we say that we spend time, we live on borrowed time, we waste time, we budget time. Of course, time is not actually a limited resource. This particular metaphor only came into being with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. But as anyone who has spent too many hours in a doctor's office can attest, the experience of wasting time feels very real. The cognitive linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson call this time as a limited resource an example of a metaphor we live by. It's so fundamental to our experience that we don't even realize it's a metaphor. We use these types of metaphors all the time. Another example is that anger is a hot liquid in a container. We blow our top. We get steamed up without consciously thinking, okay, I'm now describing a powerful experience with a metaphor. So for many people who are uncomfortable with religion generally and God language specifically, some very powerful assumptions about what belief in God means are grounded in metaphors that we're not entirely aware of. Rabbi Toba draws on the work of author James Geary, who outlines a typology of metaphor using the analogy of a volcano's lifespan. So first you have active, and then you have dormant, and then you have extinct. So in the active category are metaphors that strike us as lively and evocative. For example, the poet Mary Oliver's phrase, "the dark hug of time." Dormant metaphors are those that we still recognize as metaphors but have become cliche. For example, I'm up a creek without a paddle. Extinct metaphors are those metaphors we tend to understand as literal truth, forgetting that they're indeed metaphors. An example is, I see what you mean. Of course, we don't actually see anything when we agree with someone. That's what makes this a metaphor. But underlying this expression is a very common conceptual metaphor that knowing is seeing, which is based in our experience as infants who think that something or someone ceases to exist when they can't be seen. Now, what is most powerful about extinct metaphors is that they're not really extinct at all. Quite the opposite. We take them so for granted that we think they're describing reality as it is. They are those metaphors that we live by. So what Rabbi Toba is suggesting here is that for many, many people, God has become an extinct metaphor. Regardless of what we say we believe or we don't believe, when most of us say the word God, what we're referring to is actually a metaphor that God is a big, powerful person. Then what we profess to believe or disbelieve is that metaphor. I think this is such an important point. So many of our theological struggles or those of those we know and engage in these kinds of discussions with are when we've fallen into this unconscious assumption of the conceptual metaphor that God is a big, powerful person. We don't need to continue to fall into that mode of thinking once we start to become aware of it. Because just as the metaphor that time is a limited resource is just one way of understanding and experiencing time, there are many ways and metaphors for accessing the realm of the sacred. Rabbi Toba spends much of her book exploring these other metaphors for God. Many of them come directly from Jewish tradition, but they haven't been given as much prominence as the God is a big person metaphor that we particularly find prominently during this time of year in our liturgy. And some of her metaphors are new. So one example that I'll go into here is that one of the most common biblical metaphors for God is water. In Psalm 92, we read, "My soul thirsts for God." In Psalm 36, it says, "You give us drink from the stream of your delight." The divine source of life is described elsewhere as both the fountain of living waters and the well of liberation. In these and similar verses, the verbs describing divine action are vastly different than those attributed to God as a big, powerful person. Water does not command or judge. It flows, it irrigates, it nourishes and sustains. One of the most powerful moments in the book for me was when Toba was describing taking care of her wife, Gina, in the last months of her life, as Gina eventually died from metastatic breast cancer. During this intensely difficult time, Toba was drawn to a chant composed by Rabbi Shefa Gold of a verse from Isaiah When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. From Isaiah 43. Now, Toba writes, as I struggled to understand where God was in the terrible reality I was facing, I realized that water is essential to life. Indeed, water is life. And yet sometimes it is also that which threatens me, overwhelms me, drowns me. God was at one and the same time the waters through which I was passing and that which supported me as I made my way through an unbearable reality. Facing the prospect of the death of my beloved, I didn't rail against the unfairness of an inscrutable God who had brought suffering into my life. Instead, in the slow motion heartbreak of that terrible year, I did my best to sit with the reality that ultimately faces each and every one of us. I remembered my father's instruction to lean into, not away from, the turbulence when navigating a kayak through the rapids. Her father was a kayaker. I understood that waves can be overwhelming and terrifying, and yet within them is the godly presence that sustains and supports me, even in the most difficult moments. I gave myself over to the overwhelming waters, allowing myself to feel the profound sorrow within them, even as I sought the reassurance of God's presence accompanying me as I made my way down the river. So powerful. My favorite modern metaphor that she brings, that I'll just mention super briefly, is this idea of God as GPS, what she calls the godly positioning system. That, among other things, asks us the spiritual question asked of Adam and Eve, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you? And so look in the book, though there's lots more other fascinating examples. The other really important thing to remember here is that metaphors don't define what something is. A metaphor gives us an access to an experience, a way to think about it, to talk about it, and to act on that experience. It's really the experience element that's so important. For all of our different God metaphors that we have, old ones and new ones, a crucial question is, what kind of experience does this metaphor lead to if I engage in it? Reading Toba's book pushed me to think about the core metaphors in my own conception of God. I was blessed to discover the Jewish mystical tradition in my mid-20s, particularly Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism. And there I encountered a rich and evocative language for speaking about divinity that was completely different than anything I had encountered before in my very limited Jewish education. It was a way of speaking about divinity that really made laughable the idea that God is a big person, that metaphor. And it helped me to leave that metaphor largely behind quite quickly. Let me give you an example of one powerful text that has stayed with me over multiple years. It's an anonymous 18th century Hasidic text from the school of the Baal Shem Tov. I'm going to read it a little bit slowly because it packs a lot in and draws on multiple metaphors. It says, "It's a great advantage when a person continually contemplates in their heart that they are in the presence of the blessed Creator and that it is surrounding them on all sides. A person should be so connected that they do not need to continually resettle themselves that they are in the presence of the Blessed One. Rather, that they should behold the blessed Creator within their consciousness and realize that one is the place, the makom of the world. That is to say that it existed before the world was created, and the world exists within the blessed Creator. One can contemplate that the blessed Creator is Ein Sof, is infinite, encompassing all the worlds and its divine energy, Shefa, flows from above to below through channels in all the worlds. We are always walking within the blessed Creator, and we cannot make a single movement without its vitalizing energy. So that's the 18th century text. This divine being, what our author here calls the blessed Creator, is this medium in which we are all swimming, which is continually giving us life and existence from moment to moment. In this ideal spiritual state, one's continually resting within God, the place of the world. So that presence is always there, but we're not always present to it. We need to take that intentional moment or two, or maybe more, to place ourselves in the presence, to remember it, to orient to it. This text speaks of divinity in ways that are quite similar to what is found in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, of God as of God, or of ultimate reality as consciousness even. Now, I wondered, is understanding God as consciousness a conceptual metaphor? That seemed kind of strange to say, so that felt like one area where I diverged a little bit in my own understanding from Rabbi Toba. This text is an example, one of many, of what you could call non-dual theology. And one of the core things that means is that while we may experience a feeling of separateness or distance from God, we're never actually separate. We're always an expression of that one. And this has been so important and fundamental to me, and I think it's such a crucial theological idea to train in, that God is not separate from us, that we're always walking within God, even though we may lose this awareness. We're receiving this vitalizing energy as it flows from beyond to this very moment in our individual beings. So if I had to say what the most important, most fundamental God metaphor for me is, drawing on this text, it would be of the divine as flowing energy, the flowing energy of being or existence. And this is basically what's meant by the Shekhinah, or the divine presence, in much of the Hasidic tradition in particular. And the test, again, of a metaphor is the experience, and what does it actually do for us? And I find that this one does so much for me. I think it provides a way in to God language for our critical minds. It doesn't clash with contemporary science, which sees the ongoing process of existence as one of unfolding of energy. Einstein discovered the equivalence of mass and energy, and ultimately matter is not distinct from energy, but simply energy that has assumed a particular pattern. We are just expressions of that energy, and we happen to be blessed to have the capacity to know ourselves as such. One way this idea of God, this metaphor of God as life energy, becomes powerfully experientially real for me is when I sit and daven in my backyard pollinator garden. Pollinator garden really excels at this time of year in late summer, early fall. We have 2 types of asters blooming, 2 or 3 types of goldenrod. They're all blooming at the same time. And so I watch before my eyes the unfolding of existence through the flowers, the pollinators, all alive and vibrating with life energy. That very same life energy I can feel and cultivate in my own body when I slow down to pay attention. When I fully take in that incredible display of life energy in front of me, even if it's just a regular Tuesday morning, nothing special, I find that it's just so easy to then want to praise, to appreciate it, and then that is what the words of the prayer book are for. This divine metaphor also brings a profound sense of obligation because I want to protect and extend the flow of that life energy into the world so that it can be maximally vibrant and nourishing. And I know how we as humans in our immense ignorance do so much to stop the flow of that divine life energy. There's other important theological questions that this root metaphor brings up that I'll just nod to here. Is this living energy conscious? Well, I believe and experience that it is. Can it communicate with us or respond to us? I believe and experience that it can, through intuition, insight, other forms of deeper knowing that arise in the depths of our hearts and our minds. So to close, in the Torah service, just before we start the processional, after we've taken the Torah out, we say, Gadlu l'Adonai iti. And the conventional translation of that is, exalt God with me, or make God great with me. Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi drashed those words as an instruction instead to enlarge and expand our conception of God, to make that more gadol, that greater and vast. We don't want to end up with a small God. Rabbi Toba shows us many ways through her book of how to play with a bigger palette of metaphor for which to understand the divine, how not to be trapped by unconscious metaphors. And I've tried to be real with you about how all of this works for me in my spiritual life. Find a way in that works for you. Play with multiple metaphors, experiment. And if you've found a way in already, keep experimenting, keep going deeper. Shana Tova.